this afternoon. We are going to start now, and I'm Nuzhat Jaffrey. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. We welcome you all to this book talk with Dr. Ziba Mir-Hosseini. I'd like to begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Praise be to God, Lord of all the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. It is you we worship. It is you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not those who are the objects of anger, nor those who go astray. So I read the translation first. I'm now going to read it in Arabic. The Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. So I happen to be in Winnipeg, Manitoba today, and I'd like to acknowledge that Winnipeg is located within Treaty Number 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Ojibwe, Innu, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota, and is the birthplace of the Métis Nation and the heart of the Métis Nation homeland. So usually I'm in Toronto, and I start my acknowledgements in Toronto that way, but I happen to be in Winnipeg, and I'm delighted to be here. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce you to our speaker this afternoon. She's going to talk about her amazing book. Dr. Ziba Mir-Hosseini is a legal anthropologist specializing in Islamic law, gender, and Islamic feminism, and a founding member of Musawa. She is professorial research associate at the Center for Islamic and Middle Eastern Law at SOAS, as the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She co-directed 2 award-winning feature-length documentary films on Iran, Divorce Iranian Style in 1998 and The Runaway in 2001. The author of books on Islamic family law in Iran and Morocco, Iranian clerical discourses on gender, Islamic reformist thinkers, and the revival of zina laws, she co-edited Gender Inequality in Muslim Family Law and Men in Charge, Rethinking Authority in Muslim Legal Tradition. Her latest book, which is a book she's going to talk to us about today, is Journeys Towards Gender Equality in Islam. She received the American Academy of Religion's 2015 Martin E. Marty Award for the public understanding of religion. So, Ziba, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really grateful to Canadian Council of Muslim Women for inviting me to talk about my book, Journeys Towards Gender Equality. And thank you for all of those who have joined us. The book is constructed of transcriptions of conversations with 6 reformist thinkers, 3 men and 3 women, about the spiritual and intellectual trajectories that led to their writings. So I was saying that it is conversation with 6 reformist thinking and about their work, and also the implications of their scholarship for realizing gender justice in Islamic law and Muslim societies. All 6 of them are public intellectuals whose ideas have influenced me. With some, I have done collaborative research. With others, I have interacted in academic meetings and workshops. My initial aim when I started the conversation, the project in 2009, was to make the work of these thinkers more accessible to a wider audience, in particular to women's rights activists, as alternative ways of approaching Islam and gender. As the project progressed, I realized the importance of tracing how these scholars came to know Islam and its textual sources the way that they do now. At the same time, I was bringing their knowledge of Islam into conversation with my own intellectual journey. And my own journey since early 2000 has been closely intertwined with a number of feminist scholars and activists of Musawa. So, what I want to do now is to talk a little bit about my own trajectory and how I came to develop the methodology of conversation and collaboration, and then talk about the conversation with the Sixth Reform, give you snapshots of this conversation. It all began with my experience in post-revolutionary Iran. Newly married with my doctorate in hand, I returned home from Cambridge to Tehran after the 1979 revolution. I was hoping to become a university teacher and to live happily with my husband. Neither hope was to be realized. I was disqualified from teaching on ideological grounds, and my marriage quickly fell apart. To free myself from it, I read widely in Islamic family law. And in fact, it was then that I started studying Islam. I also attended some of the new family courts, intrigued to discover how the new regime was implementing Sharia in practice. Having escaped my failed marriage, in 1984, I returned to Cambridge and started a research project on a topic on which I had now personal knowledge, that is, on marriage and divorce. Between 1985 and 89, I did field work in family courts in Iran and Morocco. I wanted to know, as an anthropologist, what it means to be married and divorced under Islamic law, whose advocates in Iran claim to be sacred. And again, as an anthropologist, I focus on marital dispute courts. And that was basically, and the strategies that men and women use when coming to the court, arguing with the judges, and also how judges come to a decision. During the months of sitting in courts and listening to litigants, observing and conversing with judges, I learned that by the time a marital dispute reaches court, whatever was sacred and ethical in the law had evaporated. Neither the judges nor the disputing couple were concerned with the sacred. What was left of the Sharia was a strong patriarchal ethos that privileged men and placed women under male authority. It was an ideology to legitimize unequal and unjust power relations in marriage. And this led to my first book, Marriage on Trial, and which is basically a comparative studies between, because I did field work in Morocco as well, comparative studies between Morocco and Iran, based on the court disputes, family law. In the early 1990s, I began to study Islamic juristic texts, seeking to understand how their ideas of male and female nature and men's and women's role in society were constructed. And in Iran, I worked with a young cleric who facilitated my entry into the seminaries in Qom, which is the center of religious learning, one of the most important centers of religious learning in Shia world. He also helped me to establish a dialogue with the male clerics who published a women's magazine that was financed by the seminaries. And the entire editorial board of that magazine were male, and all of them were clerics. In the course of this conversation, I came to realize the importance of engaging in the Islamic legal tradition, and the need to develop a language and framework to argue for justice and equality from within the tradition. And I could see how contemporary custodians of the Sharia, that is, the ulama, modified and reconstructed gender notions produced by classical jurists. It was during my research in Qom that I realized that I no longer wanted to be just an observer. I became increasingly aware of the links between ideas, identity, and politics, and I began to observe and reveal my own motives and changes in perspective in the course of my research. For my first book, Marriage on Trial, I'm not in the book. Only in the preface, I talk about, even don't talk about my divorce. But for the second book, which was Gender and Islam in Contemporary Debates with Contemporary Clerics, I actually put myself, I look at this conversations that I have with the ulama, and I provide a context for it. And also I do it as a search for understanding, my own tradition, and also a search that why and how Islamic law became patriarchal the way that it is. So it is actually, it has a different format, and the format is conversations. And I kept this format for my latest book, which is Journeys Towards Gender Equality. But whereas in Islam and Gender, my conversations are with the ulama in Qom, with whom I had no egalitarian relationships. And there were questions that I did not dare to ask. And even, when I argued and explained things, I always hide behind feminists are saying this. And it is interesting that the clerics were interested to know what is the feminist critique of Islamic law. And then while I was finishing this Islam and Gender, I met with Kim Longinato, a very well-known and experienced independent British filmmaker. And with her, I made 2 documentaries. One of them is Divorce Iranian Style, which is really inspired by Marriage on a Trial. And the film was extremely successful. It was premiered in 1998 and was broadcast on TV and won many prizes. So the experience of doing field work in Tehran courts and Moroccan courts, as well as doing field work in Qom and debates with the ulama and making the film. All this gave a new edge to my writing and research, which became more focused on family laws, rulings on marriage, divorce, custody, hijab, and zina laws. What I wanted to do was to unveil the theological and rational arguments, as well as the social and legal theories that underpin juristic notions of gender, specifically the constructs on which the whole edifice of gender inequality in Islam, in Muslim legal tradition, has been built. My aim was to undermine this edifice, to show that there is nothing sacred about it, and that consequently it is open to change. In 2001, Zaina Anwar, founder of Malaysian, one of the founders of Malaysian-based NGO Sisters in Islam, invited me to write a paper on the construction of gender in Islamic legal tradition and strategies for reform, for a conference that they had, Sisters in Islam had on family law reforms. At the time, I was also studying Sisters in Islam because my research was focused on Islamic feminism and writing the new voices that were emerging from within the tradition, especially women's voices. And when Zaina asked me to write this paper, that was the first time that I was writing not for academia, but for activists. So I had to provide answers, not only analysis. And that was a turning point for me because, and I would say that writing that paper was enabled me to cross the line from scholarship to activism. Subsequent trips to and conferences to Malaysia and Indonesia opened a new world to me. And I felt at ease both in Indonesia and Malaysia. There was none of the tension between religious and secular feminists that I was used to in forums in Europe, North Africa, where I had been presenting my work, and also in the Middle East and in Iran, especially. I now spoke and wrote not just as an academic, merely concerned to analyze and explain, but also as an activist in search of solutions. And this I found extremely liberating. And I became increasingly convinced by then that until patriarchal interpretations of the Sharia are challenged from within the tradition, there can be no meaningful and sustainable change in family laws and practices in Muslim contexts. Zaina Anwar, who shared my view and my understanding, took the initiative to organize a workshop in Istanbul in February 2007 that brought together a diverse group of activists and scholars from a range of countries. The meeting led to the formation of a planning committee charged with the task of setting out the vision, principles, and conceptual framework of Musaba, a new movement for reform of family laws and practices. We aim to link academics and activists to bring fresh perspectives on Islamic teaching. We began by commissioning a number of concept papers by reformist thinkers like Amina Wadoud, Khaled Abolfaz, Muhammad Khaled Masood, and we use these papers in order to frame our argument for equality and justice within Islamic tradition. And then in 2009, Musaba was launched in a big seminar, and some of you were there, and I very clearly remember that Alia was there as well. So when Musaba was created in 2009, what we tried to do in Musaba was to ground our claim to equality and justice from within and reform simultaneously in Islamic and human rights framework. And we developed a framework for action that worked at 4 levels: Islamic teachings, human rights, constitutional guarantees, and also lived reality. So it is actually the 4 corner. And I won't talk a lot about it, but those of you who are familiar with my work know that for us, what was important to work within Islamic tradition was the distinction between Sharia and fiqh. This is the distinction that is all often overlooked. And basically, Sharia, meaning the way in Muslim belief is God's will as revealed to Prophet Muhammad. And fiqh, meaning which literally means understanding in Islamic, understanding in Arabic, is Islamic jurisprudence, the process and the methodology for discerning and extracting legal rulings from the sacred sources of Islam, that is the Quran and the Sunnah. So like any other systems of jurisprudence and fiqh, it is temporal and local. This distinction actually gave us the language and conceptual tool to argue for gender equality from within Muslim legal tradition. Contemporary Muslim laws, we contend, are neither divine nor immutable. They are the product of fiqh as developed by classical jurists in vastly different historical, social, and economic contexts. They belong to the realm of ma'amelat, that is social contracts, and are open to new interpretations through ijtihad. So that was the background. And it was against this background that in September 2009, Musawa was launched in February 2009, I began my conversation project. And this time I wanted to talk with reform thinkers, whereas in my previous work, I talked with the traditional ulama. Two events earlier that year gave me optimism. That was the launch of Musawa in February, and the second was the rise of protest movement in Iran in the aftermath of the disputed June elections, in which women and youth were in the forefront. I saw both events as early signs of collective challenge from within to patriarchal and despotic versions of Islam. My first conversation was with Abdullahi al-Naim, the well-known Sudanese academic teaching at Emory University. I was inspired by al-Naim's pioneering work on Islam and human rights. He had something new and constructive to say on areas of tension between Islamic and human rights law, as well as developing strategies for addressing them. In his work, he also addressed the question of women's rights and engaged with activism on the ground, speaking in the conferences all over the world, including those organized by groups like Sisters in Islam. In 2007, as the idea of Musawa was taking shape, Zaina Anwar invited Al-Naim to contribute a paper on Islam and human rights from a reformist perspective. To our surprise, he responded to the effect that I'm done with this type of approach. I also saw his 2008 book, Islam and the Secular State, as a departure from his earlier approach. Notably, his first book, 1990 book, Towards Reformation in Islam. One central theme of that work, his earlier work, was that secularization will not resolve the problem of human rights in Muslim contexts. What is needed is a comprehensive reformation from within Islamic tradition. And he put forward a reformist methodology inspired by the ideas of his teacher, Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, the Sudanese religious thinker and leader. In 2008, Al-Naim had a new book. And in that new book, he made, which is called Islam and the Secular State, he made a strong case for the necessity of a secular state as prerequisite to this reformation, i.e. that reformation cannot happen without having a secular state. So I was wondering, why had he departed from his earlier project of reformation within Islamic law? And I asked him. And what I do in the book is to provide an introduction to the work of each scholar and also the occasion of our conversation and why I decided to talk to them. Now I quote from him, and that is what Al-Naim said. It's not a departure at all. In fact, it is going deeper within the same approach that has two tracks. One is about the internal transformation of Muslim understandings of Sharia and the practice of the Sharia. The second track is the external conditions that enable this internal transformation and conversation to take place. In other words, I have first to address the political, legal, constitutional, and human rights dimension, not as an end itself, but as means to the end. I need the external conditions to protect the space that I need in order to be as radical as I care, to be in the internal conversation among Muslims about Islam. As our conversation progressed, our differences in approach and strategy became apparent. They revolved around two things. One was that Al-Na'im rejection of the distinction between Sharia and fiqh, which he used interchangeably in his work. He never made a distinction between the two. For him, it was an intellectual dishonesty, this distinction, as well as a futile strategy for opening space for debate. The other was the engagement with the traditional ulama and religious centers of learning, which he saw as futile. Whereas I saw the distinction between Sharia and fiqh as essential for challenging patriarchy from within, and the engagement with the ulama to be vital, with the centers of religious learning to be vital to internal transformation of Muslim understanding of Sharia. Our conversation ended without resolving our differences in approach, but it set the scene for what was to follow. It reinforced my conviction of the need for the distinction, as well as women's participation in the production of knowledge in Islam and engagement with traditionalist reformist thinking. My next two conversations were with two scholars of the Quran, Amina Wadud and Asma Lamrabit. They became, this conversation, explorations of possibilities and challenges through sacred and shared experiences and a joint endeavor to find ways to move ahead. This conversation unfolded between 2010 and 2014 during the progress of Musawa's first research project, in which three of us were involved. Musawa's research project was about rethinking two juristic concepts, qawama and wilaya, that lie at the basis of gender inequality in Muslim family law. Qawama denotes a husband's authority over women, over his wife, and wilaya, the right and duty of male family members to exercise guardianship over female members. As constructed by classical jurists and reflected in current laws and practices, these concepts placed women under male guardianship. And the project resulted in two books. One is Men in Charge, Rethinking Male Authority in Muslim Tradition, which was published in 2015 and is a recollection of analytical and theoretical papers critically engaging with these two concepts and redefining them in line with the contemporary notions of justice. The other one is a shorter book, Women's Life, Women's Stories, Male Authority in Muslim Context. And this book documents the life stories of Muslim women and men in different countries and reveals how they experience, understand, and context these two concepts in their lived realities. Amina Wadud and Asma Lamrabit both contributed chapters to Men in Charge, and our recorded conversation took place while the project was being carried out. I knew both of them well and worked with them closely, and we shared the same vision. I used the occasion that I met with these scholars as opening these conversations and recording them. So let me go to what chapter on Amina Wadud. Amina Wadud is an African American, and converted to Islam in 1972. Her first book, Women and Quran, published in 1992, was later published by Oxford University Press, was translated into many languages and became a seminal text for Muslim reformers. In 2005, she caused controversy by leading a mixed public prayer in New York. I was interested to know about her conversion and her evolving journey from adherence, because she started as a Salafi and from a Salafi framework to writing. I was really interested how she evolved from writing from a Salafi position and wearing niqab to writing women in the Quran. And yet, Amina Badoud was one of the founding members of Sister Islam in 1988. For a long time, she refused to identify as feminist. So one of my questions was why? And that is what she says in her own words. In the 1990s, that is, quote Amina Badoud, I struggled with two discourses led by Muslim women who argued that feminism and Islam are irreconcilable. The best way I can describe this time is that feminism was not wide enough to embrace Islam, but Islam wasn't universal enough to embrace feminism. It was a living reality for many people, including myself, who weren't willing to give up on the other. I had to take both of them. The launch of Musawa, again, this is the quote, the launch of Musawa in 2009 was really transformative for me. It was there that I began to see the political, social, cultural impact of this gender inclusive analysis of Islam. And I said, well, there it is. That is what Islamic feminism is, and I was more comfortable with it. I felt that I was part of a global community. This didn't mean that everybody agreed on a set of issues. However, we were all in universal agreement with the fact that there was oppression occurring in the name of Islam that did not experience Islam in that way, and therefore felt imperative to affirm an experience by unifying our forces in order to bring about a much more publicly realized articulation of Islam. Clearly, the battle is not over, but the launch was a moment of collective awareness on those issues. The next chapter is on Asma Lamrabet. She started from the opposite position. A Moroccan medical doctor around 1990s, she felt betrayed and disillusioned by secularism and began to study her own faith and to write about it. I came to know her through her book, Quran and Women, an Emancipatory Reading, published in French in 2007, which received a great deal of attention. It appeared while I was doing research on recent family reforms, law reforms in Iran and Morocco. And we met during one of my field trips in 2008, and we developed a friendship. And in fact, I was the one who connected her to Fatima Mir-Nisi. And in 2011, Asma Lamrabet became the director of the first Women's Studies Center, which was established in the largest network of ulama in Morocco, called Rabita Muhammadiyya or Muhammadiyya Network, which made her a public figure. It was then that she became involved in Musawa's research project. She resigned her directorship in March 2018 during the campaign of women's group in Morocco for equal rights in inheritance law. Her opinion, that she was in an academic panel, and she said that the Quran teaches equality between men and women in inheritance. This was widely quoted in the press. But it ended with a strained relationship with the ulama. So the Rabita Muhammadiyya ulama were extremely upset and angry and wanted her to take it back. And she didn't, and she resigned. In one of the conversations that we had in 2014, she described the abyss between her approach and that of the ulama in the Rabita. Let me quote. When we have a holistic vision of the text and fully grasp its intellectual and contextual meaning, it is impossible to conclude that there is discrimination. 90% of the Quran refers to insan, human being, laying the path for proper action and behavior. it gives a great deal of importance to other concepts that are interconnected with the human, such as aql, reason. The ulama study and memorize the Quran, but their knowledge of the text is superficial. All their arguments come from hadith and tafsir. This, she quotes, this alim says that sheikh said this. They have locked the Quran in the closet and are relying on exegesis. And then she asked, I want to summarize that, she said, I keep on asking myself, why is there a discrimination? Why they are not using their reason? Why? And also why we, the women who are in the center of Rabita, are not working, are not challenging them as well. Now I want to turn to the last three conversations with the scholars who have, so far it was on the Quran and human rights, but the last three are the scholars that critically engage with usul al-fiqh, that is legal theory, and propose strategies for substantive reform. All of them are well versed in the tradition and modern education, and they are redefining the conventional relationship between Sharia fiqh and the state law. One of them is Khaled Abul Fazl, the Egyptian scholar teaching at UCLA in Los Angeles, whose critique of modern puritanical jurists I found enlightening. The first time I met him was in 1999 during a panel discussion, and we have kept in touch then. After the 9/11 attacks, he became more vocal in his critique of Salafi Islam. That made him a public figure in the US press, but also a target of Muslim extremists' anger. In January 2014, he invited me to his home in Los Angeles, and we talked for several hours. Of course, before that, I contacted him. And he recounted his religious and legal education in Egypt and the US. Two things became clear to me during this conversation. One was his mother's deep influence on his ethical understanding of Islam and his search for justice. The other was the important role in making his work known, played by his wife, Grace, who had converted to Islam before they met. And when we talked, Khaled had just submitted the manuscript of his latest book, Reasoning with God, Reclaiming Sharia in a Modern World. He spoke passionately about the book, in which he devoted and developed different elements of his reform methodology into a coherent system. That is how he talks about his journey in the book. Before that, another of his book was so important for me, instrumental, was Speaking in God's Name. So he says, in Speaking in God's Name, I argue that it is not sufficient to do a comprehensive systematic work in searching the text. One must also take an ethical stance as a reader. But in Reasoning with God, that's his latest book, I have developed the notion of ultra text dalir, that is a reasoning indicator beyond the text. That entails reasoning outside the text. I argue for an epistemological shift in our approach to Sharia, that it must be understood and approached as a moral dialogue through parables. The Quran is not an instruction book. It is a book of wisdom and an infinite engagement in layers of reflective thinking about our moral beings, our existential situation, and from where we have come and where we go. How much time do I have? Because I have about 10 more minutes to go. Is
Yeah,
that
you.
okay?
So we may have to extend our Q&A period a little bit if you're still available. But
Yes,
please,
I'm available, but if
yeah,
you're willing, yes.
sure. Please go ahead.
Because I find, what Khaled Abul Faz says is so important. So I want to quote more of him. He says, my whole argument is that there is Sharia as a moral order. I go through the discussion of the Quran usage of hudud. One of the things that I notice is that, as far as we know, the initial usage of the term hudud in the Quran concerns disputes about women's share uh, or something that involves women. The Quran comes and settles the dispute in one way or the other, and then emphasizes, quote from the Quran, do not offend them, do not transgress upon them, and be mindful of hududul Allah, of God's boundary. Look at the moral dynamics here. There was an interactive process in which there was a problem, and you realize it is as though the Quran every time knows that the human resists doing what is just, resists the trajectory of justice, and emphasizes it by telling you that these are the boundaries of God. And his book is fantastic, actually. I find him among the very enlightened thinkers. The last two conversations for the book are with Mohsen Kadivar and Sadiqa Basmaghi, Iranian scholars with whom I have been collaborating since about 2010. Both are prominent members of the new trend of reformist thought in post-revolutionary Iran known as New Religious Thinking. Both had to leave the country in the aftermath of the disputed presidential election in 2009 and the emergence of Green Movement, in which they remained active. In October 2017, I engaged Mohsen Kadivar in a conversation about abandoning his university studies in engineering in the 1980s and going to Qom seminaries and his time there, and how his approach radically changed since then, in the last 2 decades. And I quote him, because he studied seminary. He did seminary studies. He started from a traditional perspective and premise, and then moved to develop a reformist one. He says, I can say that around 2000, I went through a huge transformation in my intellectual orientation. In effect, I experienced a kind of paradigm shift. I first knocked on every door in classical fiqh and learned whatever was there. I tried to find any opening in support of reform. For example, take the question of Islam and democracy, which was a hot topic early in Mr. Khatami's presidency. That is among the reformist time in the between 1997 and 2004. I supported the concept of Islamic democracy that Khatami advocated and even tried to explicate its basis in Islam. I wrote articles on the topic. However, in the new phase of my intellectual journey, I made it clear in my writings that I no longer defend Islamic democracy. What I defend is that we have a democratic interpretation of Islam. These are two different positions. In the first, modern concepts such as democracy are confused with concepts from the Quran and Sunnah, such as shura, consultation, bay'at, allegiance. In the second position, which I currently adhere to, the idea of democracy is a modern concept, like human rights and nation state, and there is no contradiction between them and Islamic ideals and the Quran. Kadivar has pursued his project through an engagement with fiqh that can open a constructive dialogue between traditional fiqh and modern notions such as human rights and gender equality. He has developed a reformist methodology that he calls structural ijtihad or ijtihad in principles and foundations, which we discussed at length in our conversation in the book. My final conversation was with Sadiqa Vasmaqi, who is one of the few women to have both seminary training and a doctorate in fiqh from Tehran University. She is also both a renowned poet and a major voice of reform. She was elected to the first Islamic City Council of Tehran and served as its speaker between 1999 and 2003. Then she left public office and devoted herself to writing, producing two books critical of Islamic jurisprudence and its treatment of women. In the aftermath of the 2000 upheavals, to avoid prosecution, she left the country in 2011 to be a visiting professor in Germany and then moved to Uppsala in Switzerland, but decided to go back to Iran in 2017. Our conversation, which took place via Skype in November that year, revolved around her latest book, Reading Sharia, in Persian, Bazkhani Sharia, which she wanted to complete before returning to Iran. And what makes this book compelling is that she uses the Usuli jurist own methodology to refute the very basis of their claims. The term Usuli, which is derived from Usul al-Fiqh, comprises those jurists who use its methodology when inferring religious laws, that is ahkam al-Shar'i, from the four valid sources, which in the Shia jurisprudence is the Quran, Hadith, Aql, reason, and Ijma, consensus. Qiyas or analogy does not exist in Shia usulis, for Shia usulis. So I quote from her what she says. And her project is basically to separate fiqh from the lawmaking. She says, when we read a religious source, our aim is to understand what God requires from us. Our understanding of the Quran is not absolute, as I discuss in detail in the book. I do not believe that we can say with certainty what God requires from us today. And this is why I came up with all these introductory arguments, to argue that we can at least limit Sharia to what logic approves and what does not harm the day-to-day lives of individuals, that is, ibadat and moral conduct. If we cannot be certain that rules governing everybody's life are part of the Sharia, imposing them on people and their life is injustice towards people as well as towards Islam as a religion. It is harmful to people's life. That is what experience has shown us, both in the Islamic Republic of Iran and the groups like Daesh that claim that they are enforcing Sharia law. We see that Islamic Republic in Iran cannot enforce many of the laws that it claims to be Sharia law. People protest against them. They are so unjust and out of tune with people's lives that they are not enforceable. Ultimately, I argue that we are making a mistake about the Sharia rules and the definition of religion and Sharia, as well as the role of religion in society. The biggest mistake is to use religion as a source of law. So these are the 6 chapters of the book and conversation, and I want to end with summarizing some of the arguments that I make in the conclusion of the book. First, the idea about gender, equality, and justice in Islam are socially constructed. They are shaped and evolved in interaction with ideological, political, socioeconomic forces, and people's experiences and expectations. The same goes for interpretations of Islam's sacred texts and the legal rulings that classical jurists have derived from them. Second, the struggle for gender equality is part of the larger struggle for social justice, democracy, and pluralism, which in Muslim context has been enmeshed in an intricate dialectics between religion and politics. In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the rise of political Islam and the instrumental use of Sharia as a source of political legitimacy not only exposed the intimate links between theology and law and politics, but put the Sharia at the center of contestation. New forms of scholarship and activism, including Musawa and my interlocutors, have emerged and are beginning to change the established understanding of the Sharia. They start from the premise that the textual sources of Islam are not inherently patriarchal, nor do they set out an exhaustive set of eternal laws. Quran upholds justice and exhorts Muslims to stand for justice, but it does not define justice. Rather, it indicates the path to follow towards justice, the meaning of which is always time-bound and context-bound. It gives us ethical guidance and principles for the creation of just laws. Thank you, and thank you for listening to me, and sorry for taking much longer, and also that I couldn't show the beautiful slides, but all of you have it.
Thank you so much, Ziba. That was really fascinating, very informative, and I know people started to comment or ask questions in the chat. Now I have to ask our audience and yourself if you can indulge us for maybe another 10 minutes or so. I don't want to take up people's Saturday to prolong the session, but I think there's a lot of interest. People have put some comments and questions in, so I think it would be appropriate for us to address them. So I hope it's all right with everybody. Let's say that we'll end the whole thing at 1:15 our time. That would be what, 6:15 your time? No, 7:15 your time.
Yes,
Anyway,
that's okay.
so,
Yes.
yeah, so I'm going to, so Mema, I'm going to excuse you from this because I want to get to some of the comments and questions right away, because I'm sure you've been following them. So if you don't mind, I'll just continue here. So the first few questions come from Zahra Hojjati, and she says, when you make a distinction between Sharia and fiqh, what are you trying to make, and who and how one has authority to define Sharia? So please explain it more, as fiqh is a knowledge and ability to define the Sharia. So maybe you can take that question first, and then she had a few others.
Yes, and I really recommend you to read the chapter conversation and also some of Musawa's work. For me and for us in Musawa, Sharia is transcendental. Sharia is what is revealed to the Prophet. And Sharia in the Quran never appears in the sense of law. And at the earliest centuries of Islam, at least in the first 2 centuries, never the term Sharia was used in referring to law. But later on, when the fiqh schools came. But any understanding of Sharia is always an interpretation. So the person who interprets a Sharia is shaped by his or her context, her gender, and her notions of justice of the time. So it is open. It is open to interpretation, and it is open to contestation as well. But at the same time, there are basic principles of the Sharia, which is the guidance and justice, and also mercy. But any law, any jurisprudence is human. And the problem with us is that in Muslim legal tradition is that men only interpreted the law. Of course, women were there, but their voices were silenced by the time that fiqh emerged. And we have women in hadith scholars, but not in fiqh. Even, the teacher, one of the teachers of Shafi'i was a woman, but, you don't have their work. And so this distinction, it is important because it enables us to pose a critical and ethical critique and rational critique of pre-modern interpretations of the Sharia. And these pre-modern interpretations of the Sharia are still considered by many, especially in centers of religious learning, to be the established interpretations of the Sharia. So it gives us an argument, it gives us a language to argue from within the tradition. And I will end it here because this is a very complex topic, and especially in the chapter with Abdullahi al-Naim, we discuss this in detail. And at the end, I must say, Abdullahi al-Naim and I, we agree, but we use different vocabularies to talk about Sharia and fiqh. And for me, the language matters because it is through the language that we are able to argue for things. And it is important not to consider fiqh, the knowledge that it is produced, the religious knowledge, as sacred, because knowledge is always produced in interaction with other branches of knowledge and also in conversation and with the culture and with the social reality.
Great.
I hope, Zara, it's okay for the time being, but I'm happy to have a conversation
I know it's
any
a
other time.
very
Thank you.
complex.
Anyways, thank you so much. But it is something that, yeah, should think and talk more about that. Thank you for
For
now.
sure. Thank you. She had another question where she says, is there any specific reason you chose Morocco and Iran for comparisons, or why not some other countries?
I wanted to do comparison at that time in 1980s in Saudi Arabia because both of them were religious-based systems, but in law. But I never could get a permission, and finally I went to Morocco. And Morocco, and I think I made a good choice because Morocco follows the school of Maliki, the Sunni, which is, and also belongs to a different cultural tradition. And so that is why I chose it. And, some of the choices that we make in life is really decided by circumstances, and that was one of the circumstances. But I'm glad that I went there because it was there that I met Fatima Mernissi. It was there that I met Moroccan women activists. And somehow it was there that I became a feminist. When I went to Morocco at the late 1980s, I was very angry, of the injustices which is done in the name of Islam. And I didn't have the tools, the concepts, the knowledge to challenge them. So, when you cannot challenge something, you are rejected. So I was in that position. But when I went to Morocco, I actually saw the same kind of culture, the same kind of legal system and the law, which was at that time was based on Maliki fiqh without reforms. And I saw that women have a better access to justice in 1980s in Iran than Morocco. So for me, it was really a healing process. And you understand these changes much later. And I identify with Morocco very much. And in the two chapters, that is 2 chapters on Iran, I provide a context for the evolution of the thought and reform thinking in Iran, and the same in Morocco as well. So I talk about the context as well, because I feel that I understand Morocco a little bit after living there for a year and studying the society since then.
Okay, so one last question from Zahra, and then we'll move on. She actually asks a very interesting question. She says, do you consider yourself an Islamic feminist or a Muslim feminist?
You know, if you had asked this question from me in early 1990s, when I started to write about Islamic feminism, 1990s and early 2000, I would have said, no, I'm not an Islamic feminist. I'm a Muslim feminist, because Islamic, with the moment that you say Islamic, it is synonymous with political Islam. That you want to enforce Sharia, you want to have a pre-modern interpretation of the Sharia, which is fair, and also those pre-modern interpretation, there is no room for gender equality. And but later on, you know, when Musawa began, and when I learned through conversations with others, I came to realize the importance of using the term Islamic feminism, because we are producing knowledge, egalitarian knowledge from within. And the source of, for Muslim feminists or Islamic feminists, the source of their source of authority are their tradition, the Quran, and their the prophets' examples. So they work within the tradition and claim it. And since patriarchy is justified in the name of Islam, I think it is important to challenge it also in the name of Islam. So I'm now comfortable with both of them. And Iranian women, you know, for them, after 40 years, you must have been following what is happening. After 43 years of imposing this unjust laws and constantly change it as well, and also this culture of hijab, which is not only about the covering your hair, because that is a choice. It is about restricting every sphere of your life and assigning you a second-class citizen. That has actually enraged people. So in Iran, you know, nobody wants to be an Islamic feminist, or in that time, you know, Islamic feminism started the conversation in Iran in 1990s and Malaysia. So it is developing, it is evolving, and I believe in it as a knowledge project and as activism as well. And I think it has an important role to play. And it is an integral and important part of the reform movement. And I think, in fact, these are the Muslim scholars, many of them are women who are working on gender, who are holding the helm of the reform. In practice, which is important, not in theory only.
Thank you. Well, you've demonstrated that by the work that you've done and your interlocutors, people that you engaged in conversation, and certainly the women that you spoke with, and all of the women in Musawa, and a lot of the women who are here today, you know, are engaged in those conversations as well. You know, your scholarship is impeccable, commendable, and your experiences with all of the different scholars that you have worked with, including the ulama, which I think it's really, really important. So thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I know it's evening in London, so we appreciated your time in the book. Everybody should get a copy. It is fascinating. I know I wanted to ask you a little bit about what Asma had said about the hijab and the khimar in the conversation with you in the book, but I think I'm going to leave that for another day. And in fact, people should read the book and the chapter about that, because the discussion is fascinating. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you. May I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. First of all, I want to acknowledge that Isatu Turay is with us. She is a founding member of Musawa.
Yes.
Since 2000. So this is really, really a pleasure. Amira Abu Talib is with us. She is now in the board of Musawa. And Yasmin Amin, one of the scholars who has been contributing to our work in Musawa. So it's so nice to see these names and their support here. And the fact is that we are all working together. And Canadian Muslim women started the work long before us, and we are all having the same journey. And it is a journey, and this is a journey towards gender equality. And I feel that we are all part of it, and I'm honored to be part of this journey with all of you.
Absolutely. And it's so nice to see our Musawa friends here. Quite remarkable. And I know I have no idea what time it is wherever you are. So thank you so much, Yasmin, Amiri, and Isatu for being here. I'm now going to pass on the mic, as it were, to Nina. And again, thank you, Ziba, for being with us. Nina, over to you.
Thanks, Nusrat. Ziba, thank you so much for all of your efforts in shining a light on the experience of Muslim women with regard to gender equality in Islam. Your description, your conversations with the 6 Muslim intellectuals in your book was so interesting. And a few of them are friends of CCMW and have helped our organization in the past. In the chat, Aliyah Hogben noted that, with Abdullahi and Naeem being one of them. May God protect the scholars of the world who give their life in the pursuit of truth and justice. We know in Surah An-Nisa, verse 124, the Holy Quran states, "If any do deeds of righteousness, be they male or female, and have faith, they will enter heaven, and not the least of injustice will be done to them." Finally, many thanks to our team at CCMW. Nuzhat, Iman, and Umayma have been instrumental in bringing this seminar together. Thanks to all of you who tuned in today. From near and far, your support and friendship are much appreciated, and we're happy to see old friends and new faces here today. Please remember to keep in touch with CCMW, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. Follow our website and social media posts for upcoming events and projects. Until then, take care, and assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.